My name is Yolanda Chavez Leyva, and I was born in Juarez and raised in El Paso. I was born in 1956, so I'm about to turn 63 years old. I've lived half my life in El Paso. I also lived in Austin for many years. I lived in San Antonio. I lived in Tucson. And I always kept coming back to El Paso. So I finally decided just to come back to El Paso for good. My family's from Chihuahua. My mother, who raised me, was born in Chihuahua in 1912, and my father was born somewhere in Durango or Chihuahua in 1910. They were my adoptive parents. My biological mother gave me to her great aunt and uncle when I was born. When I was born in Juarez in the mid-50s, my biological mother was very young, not married. I just recently found out who my biological father was. And she, I guess, didn't know how she would be able to raise twins. When we were born, we were just 2 pounds each, and we had a lot of medical needs. So she gave us to her great aunt. No, I'm sorry. She gave us to my great aunt and my great uncle who adopted me. And she gave my sister to my grandmother, and my sister died pretty quickly in Juarez because she didn't have medical care. So when I say my mom and daddy, I'm thinking about my adoptive parents.
What are their names?
My mama's name was Esther Chavez Leyva, and my father's name is interesting. So by the time he passed away in 1997, he was Jerry Leyva, but he was born Jeronimo Ruacho. And when he was a little kid, his father abandoned them, so he decided when he got older he wasn't going to go by his father's name, so he took his mother's name, Leyva. And then when he entered school here in El Paso in the 1910s, they didn't want to call him Jeronimo because they said it was too hard, so he became Jerry. So he went from Jeronimo Ruacho to Jerry Leyva.
Okay. Um, Thank you for that. Can you share with us some food memories from your childhood, from your young adulthood, and as an adult? Just some memories that navigate us through a little bit of your life.
So I have a lot of memories about food from throughout my whole life. So starting when I was 3, and I would hoard food. So I would hoard vegetables in the drawers, and I'm not really sure because my mother fed me very well. So I don't know, I was, and I think maybe I was born with this fear of not getting enough nutrition because I was so tiny when I was born, 2 pounds, and because I was sharing the womb with my twin sister, so I was hoarding food. So I've always been really aware of the presence of food in my life. When I was growing up, when I was a kid, I always wanted to cook, and I'd always be in the kitchen with my mother. And my mother had a very big reputation as the best cook among her comadres. Everyone wanted her food. And I would tell her, Mama, teach me how to make this, teach me how to make that. And she would always say, no, mija, you're going to cook your whole life. You should just enjoy your life right now. Because she saw housework, she saw cooking, cleaning as something that I would do forever, so why start so early? But what I did is I always watched her. So by the time I was maybe 13, 14, I knew how to cook everything just from having watched her. And I remember she would say, how do you know how to cook that? Like when I would make fideo, and I'd say, because I've been watching you my whole life. So I just observed how she cooked. Although I remember when I was about 5, my mother was very influenced by advertising because this is the 1960s. And because she came here as a young woman to the United States at a time in the 1920s when advertising was really becoming big, like she wanted to do the things that she saw on TV or in magazines earlier. So she ordered a matching apron for her and for me from Betty Crocker. And I always remember those aprons because they were pink and they were checkered, and it came with a little cookbook for kids. So we would both wear little aprons. And then the only thing I remember that we made was a salad. It was called a turtle salad. And of course, in the 1960s, everything is prepared, everything is processed. So we used canned peaches and canned cherries, and we put little cloves for the eyes. So that's the first thing I remember making with my mother. But what I remember when I was 5 is being at my tia's house. My tia Lisa was my mama's older sister, and she lived on the next block. So she was like a second mother to me. And I was always at her house. And because she was a little bit older, she was actually a little more traditional in cooking than my mother was. So she made tortillas every day. And one day I was at her house and she's making flour tortillas, and I was like, Tia, yo quiero hacer tortillas. And she's like, no, estás muy chiquita. And I was like, oh no, I make them all the time, which was a big lie. I'm like, I'm always making tortillas. And she was like, okay. So she actually taught me how to make tortillas, and I made little tiny tortillas like that. And then when I went home, I also started making tiny, tiny tortillas. And then my best friend Janet and I would use them when we were playing, like for weeks. We'd use these little tortillas and then we'd eat them. So I don't know how we didn't get sick. But I always remember my tia just humoring me that she was going to let me make tortillas. Yeah, so I have those memories from when I was little. When I was in high school, and because I was in high school in the early 70s, we had home education, home economic classes. And these home economic classes were all about sewing and cooking. So I remember loving to learn to make different things. The one that I loved to make and that my neighbors, until they passed away, reminded me that I even shared with them was eggplant parmesan. So that was pretty fancy for me. I wasn't exposed to a lot of different foods when I was young. When I think back on it, I was 20 years old before I had any pizza. I was 20 years old before I had an artichoke. I was 20 years old before I had shrimp. So those things were very mysterious and exotic to me. And I had them when I moved to Austin. And I think now how my grandchildren eat, and they have been exposed to many, many different kinds of food. So when I tell them I didn't have pizza till I was 20, they can't even imagine what that was like.
Tell us about food, since you're talking about your 20s, in college. Tell us a little bit about what food was like, memories about eating in college, and maybe your first years in your career.
So when I was 19 years old, I moved to Austin to go to UT Austin. And I lived in a women's cooperative, so we did everything. It was probably 20 women. We did the cooking for ourselves. We cleaned the house. We would rotate how to do things. So it was the first time that I learned how to cook in large quantities, because my family was a tiny family. It was my mom and daddy and me. So I only knew how to cook in little quantities. Suddenly I'm cooking for 20 people. And it was really amazing because I got to cook the things that I had seen my mother cook all those years. Like I even made tortillas and chiles rellenos. I learned how to make fried chicken. Actually, it's the only time I ever made fried chicken. The one and only time was in that co-op. And then I moved out, and I had a roommate at one point from Paris, Texas. Her name was Shelley, and she was African American, and she said she had chosen me as her roommate because she wanted to see what Mexicans were like. So I was like, that's cool. Let's see if we have things in common. And the only thing we turned out having in common was rice and beans. She says, the way you cook reminds me of the way that we cook in Paris, Texas. It's different kinds of beans, but we're beans and rice people too. So that was a good connection to make. When I started to live on my own, then I was always cooking what my mother cooked. I cooked exactly what she cooked. Like I cooked fideo, which was one of my favorite things she made. Meatloaf. I loved meatloaf. So it was a combination of like traditional American food and traditional Mexican food. So when I think about my mother, well, let me tell you the story first. Like 12 years ago, I was in Mexico, in La Ciudad de Mexico, and I was with another scholar, and her suegros lived there. So she said, we're going to go eat with my suegros, and they're from Michoacan. So we got to their house, and her suegra had prepared this elaborate, beautiful meal for us. She was an excellent cook, and she said that it was her honor to prepare a traditional meal for me. And it was things like mushroom soup, things that we don't eat in the north of Mexico or in the southwest of the United States. It was delicious. And I'm sitting there at her table enjoying her food. And then she says, and what are the traditional foods that your mother cooked, Yolanda? And I was like, I was under a lot of pressure, like, what did she cook? And the only thing I could think of was meatloaf. And then I didn't know how to say meatloaf in Spanish either. So I was like, but I said meatloaf. So when I think about my mother and her meatloaf, I think about how she grew up. So she comes to the United States in 1921, and she was 9 years old. And she's very influenced by advertising. She's in schools that have Americanization programs. Her only cookbook was this cookbook, the American Woman Cookbook, published in 1944. And it is a cookbook of very traditional American foods. Although she has a little recipe in here from a newspaper, Bizcochos de Vino, so she was also looking for that. So she has this cookbook. I think back in the 20s she was a flapper. So at a time where her very traditional parents wanted her to be a traditional Mexican young lady, she was rebelling. She cut her hair short, she wore red dresses, which is a big escándalo back then. And I can see that she started to cook in an American kind of way. She was very rebellious. She didn't learn how to sew. She didn't learn how to make tamales. She didn't make menudo. She didn't make the things that my friends' mothers made because she wanted to be a modern American. Which is strange to me because when she raised me, I was born when she was in her 40s. She didn't speak any English to me. She was very, or to me, seemed super Mexicana. So to look at this earlier part of her life where she was trying to be very American and it's reflected in her food is very kind of shocking to me to think about that. When I was growing up, she made a delicious meatloaf. Like I wanted to tell the suegra in Mexico, delicious meatloaf. She loved to make potato salad. She loved to make barbecue chicken. But she also made enchiladas, she made chile relleno, she made frijoles. Sometimes she made tortillas. So she would cook also Mexican foods. There were some dishes, and I've looked through this cookbook to see if she got them from here. There were some dishes I really loved, like fried cabbage, and fried cabbage, and she would put weenies in it. So I've looked into like who cooks fried cabbage because I don't know where that came from, and it turns out that it's a very southern dish. And then I remembered that my mother lived in West Virginia for a couple of years with my father who was in the army, but they lived with an older couple who rented a room in their house. So she also learned to cook from this older West Virginian white lady. So I said, that's where the fried cabbage came from. She even had like this southern influence in her cooking. When I think about the foods that my mama cooked, they're the same foods I cook now. I still cook fried cabbage, and I can eat a whole cabbage by myself. And I still cook frijoles in the way that she cooked frijoles. I still cook arroz in the way that she cooked arroz. So I've maintained all of her foods except for liver. I never will cook liver. She was a big lover of liver and lengua, and I don't do those two. But other than that, I've always cooked the same the same food. Other than that, I've always cooked the same foods that she cooks. But what happened was that I started to learn more about cooking from other people when I was in my 40s. In my 40s, I started to go to Mexico, mostly to La Ciudad de Mexico and also to the state of Morelos, to different indigenous villages. And that's where I started to learn more. So I know that my mother cooked nopales, for example, when I was little, but I don't have a really strong memory of that because she didn't do it too often. But then as I started to go to Mexico, nopales, amaranto, different traditional foods from central and southern Mexico started to be something important to me. So I had teachers in Mexico who taught me, for example, about los siete guerreros. There was a university in one of the indigenous towns in Morelos called Universidad Nahuatl. And I went there and took classes about los siete guerreros and learned about the very traditional foods that were the basis of our ancient ways of eating. So corn, beans, squash, chile, amaranto, maguey. That's what I remember. I'm missing one food. I don't know. But, and I started to share those siete guerreros with people here in El Paso. And even with my classes, I would tell them in my Mexican American history classes. So, what are the foods that you eat when you go to a Mexican restaurant? And they would say enchiladas, they would say tamales, they would say calabacitas. And I would say, well, let's look at that and how many of those foods are ancient. So the tamales are something pre-Hispanic, although of course they didn't use pork. The calabacitas, except for the queso, is totally pre-Hispanic. We had onion, we had corn, we had calabazas, we had tomatoes. The enchiladas, the chile, we had, I don't know how many hundreds of different chiles in our diet. And all of these things are things that I believe that we have a memory of. So when we eat something that's corn, to me, we're going back to those really ancient memories. Corn is something that we've had a relationship with for 8,000 years. And I say a relationship with that plant because corn cannot live without us. And for thousands of years, we could not live without corn. We have to plant the corn in order for it to grow. And we eat the corn in turn to honor it. So there's one of my favorite images from one of the codices, the ancient books, is a woman that's putting corn into a pot to boil, but you see the little glyph where she's speaking to the corn. And I've always thought, what is she saying to that corn? Is she saying, thank you, corn? Because the corn gave up its life to nurture us, to give us nutrition. So she's saying, thank you, corn. Is she saying, sorry, corn, I'm putting you into this hot water? But she has something that she's saying to that corn. And to me, that is the relationship that I would love to have with what I put into my body. And it's something I work on. Having grown up in the 60s, when frozen TV dinners were like super exciting, and sometimes we would have them and we'd be really happy. It's hard to have that relationship sometimes because I was raised distant from fresh corn. We always had canned corn, for example. In fact, I can think of very few things that we ate fresh. It was all processed in the 60s. So I want that relationship of understanding. And I've tried to grow corn in order to have that relationship. I've tried to grow different plantitas. I've been most successful at growing amaranto because in El Paso we think of it as a weed, like it just grows. So I've been most successful there. And it means a lot to me to be showing my grandchildren that relationship. Because if I grew up distant from the source of food, they're growing up even more distant from the source of food. When I grew up, to have fast food was once every few weeks, maybe. They have it several times a week. So they are even more distant from understanding food. And what I find with Joaquin, my grandson, is he's the one that connects to that ancientness of what it's like to have a relationship with the natural food. So I was teaching him once how to roast corn on a comal, and I had him put his hand on the corn, and you could feel it transforming. You could feel the heat affecting it. And he was so surprised that he could feel the corn changing. So he understands that food is something that you don't just taste, but I teach him smell it. I teach him feel it when it's cooking, and also listen, because we could hear the corn making little noises as it was roasting. And he's the one that really gets it. He really gets it. That makes me really happy.
Great, that's wonderful. Was there good schools in Mexico where you started developing that relationship? Are there specific people who taught you this? People, men, women? What took you to Mexico, to this particular school? And also you mentioned that you teach. Can you tell us your profession?
So I'm a professor of history, and I teach border history, I teach public history. Once in a while I teach Mexican American history. Because I teach Mexican American history, and because the vast majority of my students are Mexican American, one of the things that I really emphasize when I teach is that we have to look at our history as more than just a history of immigration. And it's true, the great majority of us are immigrants, children, grandchildren of immigrants. But that process of immigration is something that happens with the creation of the nation state. But if we think of ourselves as people who have been here in the Americas for thousands of years, because, when they do DNA studies, the average Mexican American is 40% indigenous, some more, some less. So we have roots here. So I started to take students to Mexico, and I started to take them to Nahuatl University. And Marta Oropesa was the amazing teacher that would accompany us. And we started to learn what was part of our ancestors' lives that are still part of our lives. So language and food were the two things that students really connected to, that have stayed with us over thousands of years. So we started to go there, and then also because in my own spiritual practice, as someone who connects to my indigenous roots, I've been able to study with teachers in tiny, tiny villages in el Estado de Mexico, in el Estado de Morelos, in Chihuahua. So I've been in many homes and been fed by many people. And it was in someone's home in Chihuahua where I learned how to cook nopales without water. And just the other day, because I've been looking, I had to have a name. I found it was called a nopales al vapor, is what it's called. So I started to learn those things. I started to learn in Morelos about verdolagas, which grow everywhere in El Paso as, again, a weed. So I've encountered them as something to eat in Morelos. So now every summer, because they grow in my next door neighbor's yard, I go into his yard and I pick all his verdolagas, and I've cooked them for him and said, here's from your yard. I don't know what he thinks, but verdolagas or purslane. So one of the things that I love is to just see what's around us that we can eat. So, for example, I've gone out to the desert, the Chihuahuan desert, and foraged. what is there edible. There's things like the banana yucca plant has a big fruit that if you roast it is super delicious. Or the tunas that you get out in the desert. Or I've made soup out of yucca flowers, which in Mexico are called the flores de isote. So we're surrounded by food, and I think about my ancestors, because my ancestors came from the Chihuahuan desert, the Raramuri people, the Tepehuan people, so they had to forage. So I'm trying to look for what is my food, and things like the start that one over. Things like the I can't say it. Chiles, like the I can't say it. Chiltepin. Okay. So I start to look for what's my food in the desert. And one thing that is one of our foods from this desert is the chiltepin, which is a tiny, tiny little round chile. It grows wild. You can find it in people's yards. It turns into a bush. It can live for years. And chiltepin is Nahuatl for tiny chile. And it is a tiny chile. And it's super picoso. Like I can only put one in a big pot of food because it's very picoso. And I have to fight the birds for it because the birds love it. They don't taste picosones, so they just love whatever other taste it has. So I look at what is around me that I don't have to plant, that I can forage. And that's important to me too. One time I went to Albertsons and I was looking for nopales. They didn't have any. And I asked the grocer, "You don't have any nopales?" And he just looked at me and he said, "Don't you have nopales in your yard?" And I said, "Yes, I have lots of nopales in my yard." And he goes, "Well, just go cut one." And I thought, that's true. I go buy things that are growing in my yard just for the convenience of not cleaning them myself. Yeah.
Cheese. What about cheese?
I love cheese. Cheese is one of my favorite things. And I have to tell you this story. One time I was in this little town in Chihuahua, and there's a plant here that grows that you use to make asadero cheese. And you use it to coagulate the milk. So I was in this little pueblito in Chihuahua where they all make asadero cheese. And the lady was super proud showing me her cheese. And then she said, "But you can't make it in the United States. You don't have this plant." And I said, "We have that plant everywhere in El Paso. It's considered a weed." And she was so shocked that a plant would live in the United States that was Mexican to her. So I love cheese, so that I started making cheese. And it's really changed my relationship to cheese, to make it. I taught my granddaughter how to make it a few weeks ago, and because it's chemistry too. So we had a gallon of whole milk, and we were slowly heating it up. And I told her when the little bubbles form around the sides of the pot, that's when we know to start adding vinegar, because that's what we use. So she added 1/3 of a cup of vinegar, and you could see an immediate reaction. And the milk was coagulating. Then she added the second, and we were stirring, and a little bit more of a reaction. When she added the last of the vinegar, boom, it all coagulated, and you could see the cheese and the whey, the liquid, separate. And she couldn't believe it that it happened so fast. And it was delicious. We put little jalapenos in it and sea salt, and it was really delicious how it came out. So what I've learned in teaching my grandchildren how to cook, and it's mostly vegetables and cheese, is that it changes my relationship with food. So when I spend, for example, a whole morning with Joaquin, and we're grinding pumpkin seeds, and we're putting a lot of thought and a lot of attention into grinding them like we're supposed to, and he has his molcajete and I have mine. After that, like having that close connection with food, I don't want to go out and have a hamburger. That doesn't seem like food to me anymore. And I'm a big junk food person. So for me to suddenly say, oh, that's not really food, is a big change in my life. And it's all coming from spending very dedicated time with especially Joaquin, teaching him how to do things slowly, carefully, with a lot of attention and a lot of intention. So it's been pretty miraculous to me.
That segues into another question in terms of food. What do you see is the relationship between food and spirituality?
So there's something that I learned as I started to be around indigenous elders, something that forms the basis of how I try to think about the world. And that's that everything is connected and that we're related to everything, that we're related to the plants, that we're related to the rocks, that we are related to all the elements. You know how we think about fire, the fire is the spirit in us, and we're mostly made of water, so water is in us. When we think about the earth, we are full of minerals just like the rocks, so we have a relationship with the earth and the rocks. When we think about air, like we have air, we need air to live. So as I started to learn over the past probably 25 years of being with indigenous elders that everything is connected, then you have to know that you're connected to the plants that provide your food. You have to know that we share so much in our existence. And if we do something against plants, for example, we're doing something against ourselves as well. And that goes for animals too. Now, where I struggle a lot is, so I come from Chihuahua, the biggest beef producing state in Mexico, and Texas, the biggest beef producing state in the United States. And both states love meat. And I grew up loving meat. But when I think about how animals are treated in modern agriculture, how they're slaughtered, like it creates a lot of ethical problems in me about how can I continue to eat meat. So then I say I'm not going to eat meat. But then I smell meat and I want meat. So this is my biggest food issue right now is thinking about animals. And you know, recently a senator from Mexico put out a YouTube video and she talks about how the conquest happened 500 years ago, and one of the things that the Spanish brought to the Americas were pigs. And they did because pigs provided food, but they were portable because they walked themselves and they're not big like cows. So you could, you know, have tons of pigs following the military. So she says in this video, so every time you eat tacos de carnitas, you're supporting the conquest. You're honoring the conquista. And I was like, oh, that's true, because I also teach in my classes about the importance of pigs and how pigs made the military conquest possible. So she's right about that. And then the next Saturday I went to Duranguito, and what did we have? Tacos de carnitas. But so, and I had them. so it's very complex. It's very complex because it's related to spirituality, the connection among everything living, and the earth is living, and our history with food and what food has been used against us, and just the constant pressures of modern society with fast food. You know, one of the things that I love about growing amaranto is that during the colonial period, amaranto was banned from being cultivated by indigenous people. One, because it was connected to spiritual ceremonies. And secondly, I think because amaranto is perfect nutrition. It's protein, it has minerals in it. So if you take away a food that people are dependent on and that is, you know, perfect nutrition, it weakens them. So it weakens them spiritually then because they don't have that plant, and it weakens them physically because they don't have that nutrition. And amaranto was saved only by a few villages 100 years ago, so that now it's a big health food, amaranth. So one of the things that gives me a lot of pleasure is growing amaranto, knowing that for a long time it was not allowed to be cultivated.
You sort of answered this question, but I'm going to ask it in case there's other things you want to add.
Okay.
And there's, as a public historian, what is the role that you see that food plays in people's history, people's culture, but also sense of place? And like I said, you sort of answered that question in a number of ways, but if you can add a few more sentences, if you sort of frame it as a public historian, what do you see food?
Mm-hmm. As a public historian, I do think about food and how it grounds people in public. So let me tell you this story. About 7 or 8 years ago, one of the indigenous elders here in El Paso, Beatriz Villegas, was invited to the History Museum to show people how to use a molcajete. And I went. So she had all the different ingredients to make a salsa. And she had a pretty big crowd, so she told people, come stand around me and I'm going to show you how to make salsa. And the thing the museum wanted was, Beatriz, teach them how to make salsa. It wasn't about the molcajete, it was just like, how do you make salsa? And I'm standing there in this crowd around her, and some women start to cry. And so she stopped and she asked, what are you feeling? And they said, we're crying because it reminds us of our abuelitas. And we haven't had that connection to our abuelitas since they passed away. And these were not young people. They were, in their 50s, 40s. And I thought, look at how this, ancient kitchen tool is bringing people back to their abuelitas' kitchens. And they were crying in a museum. So I knew then that food was super important in a museum setting. So I worked on an exhibit at La Mujer Obrera, which has a restaurant there in front, Café Mayapan. And we were looking at photos from the 1940s of Mexicanas and Mexicanos in El Paso. And I kept seeing these kitchen scenes that this photographer took in the 40s. So then my assistant then, Cynthia Renteria, and I decided we're going to replicate a kitchen scene, kind of. So it was a woman, an older woman sitting at her table. She had her cafecito. She had things like salt shakers. Behind her you could see a little shelf with a santo on it. So we got a table, we put a tablecloth on it that matched the photo. We found a santo more or less like her santo, a shelf more or less like her shelf, and we replicated the scene. And it was using things we found at the Salvation Army at Goodwill. So we first opened that exhibit, a woman walked in and looked at that and started crying. And I knew her, and I said, why are you crying? And she said, because this is just like my abuelita's kitchen in Juarez. And I haven't seen it since I was a little girl. And it was really very simple, but the simplest of things tied to the kitchens that we remember, tied to the foods that we remember. I'm crying right now because it brings up such emotion. And as a public historian, to me the work I do goes beyond just saying, oh, in 1848 this happened, in 1912 this happened. That's not what I think is the priority, although I do use dates. Chronology is important, but what is important to me is really to help people remember their history, to help them remember what means something to them. So when I see someone crying at the sight of a kitchen setting, or see someone being very emotional watching elder use a molcajete, I know that they're remembering their history. And this is a very broad definition of history, right? But we all have a history. And to carry on those memories, and maybe they'll go tell their children or their grandchildren, oh, today I saw this woman with a molcajete, and then they tell the story of their mother or their abuelita. Like, that's passing on a very intimate kind of history that I think is important for us, for our spiritual health, for our emotional health, and I think it affects our physical health. When I think about what has changed in El Paso since I was a little kid in the 1960s, I think I'm the one that has changed. When I was little, we didn't go out to fast food except once every few weeks, and that was Lucky Boy hamburgers. I remember my dad used to take me to Lucky Boy downtown. But one thing we did do every week that I remember my whole entire life is go to Luby's cafeteria and Fur's cafeteria. My parents took me every Sunday after Mass to the cafeteria. So I grew up with cafeteria food, and I still love it. But to go to restaurants, we never went to restaurants. Like with waiters, never, ever. I don't remember ever going to a restaurant because my father said that he felt that it was bad to order somebody around, so he wouldn't order a waiter around. So we never went to a restaurant. So it really wasn't until I moved to Austin when I was 19 that I started to experience different foods. So like Asian foods, like Vietnamese food, I had never had anything like that. So when I came back to El Paso almost 20 years ago, I looked for like the holes in the wall kind of Mexican restaurants. Those are the ones that I really like. The ones where I can talk to the owners and ask them about their food. But then I also started to see that there were restaurants like Vietnamese restaurants, German restaurants, different places that I've tried to eat. I even went to a French restaurant with Joaquin. So trying to expand my food knowledge, but when my staff and I go out to eat, they're like, where do you want to go? And I'm like, you choose, because I'll just go to the little Mexican restaurants I always go to. So there's places like Ciro's that I always go to. For many years I've gone to Café Mayapan because I like the way that they talk about bringing back indigenous ways of cooking and our relationship to food. And when I worked on a museum there in that spot, one of their practices was that nurturing ourselves with good food, with healthy food, is a radical practice. It's a way to resist our oppression. So I've gone there for a super long time. And I guess what I see is that as I'm opening up more to different kinds of cuisines, that I see that El Paso is too. And El Paso's always been according to us, the capital of Mexican food. So, but now I see all kinds of different food.
Thank you for that. In a few words, sentence, can you tell us what fundamentally food means to you, and what do you think it should mean to all of us?
Thinking about what food means to me has changed a lot over the years. And I feel like I'm still figuring out what food means to me. So food has always been something I turn to when I'm happy, when I'm sad, when I'm depressed, when I'm celebrating. So food has always been there for me in not such healthy ways. So in the past, I guess really since I started to go to Mexico, food has started to slowly mean something different to me. It has started to mean something that I can improve my health with, something that I can honor my ancestors with, something that I can connect with that idea of we're all relatives, the rocks, the plants, and the animals, and us. So it's very slowly started to change. And my prayer is that by the time I die, which I hope is around 90 and not sooner, I want to live to 90 at least, is that I will have a fully healthy relationship with food. That's my goal. Because you never stop growing, right? You never stop learning. And food has been my biggest teacher, both about how I hurt myself by eating fast food, how I hurt myself by overeating, but it's also been my biggest teacher about how to change that and how food doesn't have to be something that I obsess about in a bad way, but it can be something that I honor. So that's been my big change about food. So I would hope, and that's why I teach my grandbabies about cooking, fresh food. I would hope that people understand that food is alive. If someone is always eating fast food, it's not alive food. I went to Taco Bell yesterday with my granddaughter, and it tasted good in a way, but I guess because I always eat fast food, but it didn't feel alive to me. It didn't bring life to me in the way that cooking nopales brings life to me. So that's what I would hope for everybody.
Great. Now this is really the last question. Is there anything else that you would like to, another story, another comment, anything else that you would like to share with us that we have not yet covered?
I think the only thing that I would want to add is that in preparing for this interview, and I didn't know the questions in advance, and I thought, well, I don't know, what about food and me? So for the past 2 weeks, I've been having that question. What about food and me? What about food and my story? It's been really amazing to take the time just to think about it and to remember my mama especially, and to think about how I've changed, and to think about how what I think about food has changed. So it's been like a gift to me. I'll put it that way. It's been like a gift to me to have this opportunity to think about food.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. Okay.
I'm a sun dancer, and the sun dance is a very old ceremony that existed both in the plains area of the United States, but also existed in Mexico. So I first started sun dancing with sun dancers from Mexico. Part of that ceremony is that you fast for 4 days. In some sun dances you have some water, in some you don't. So you fast for 4 days, and it's a way to start letting go of your connection to the physical self so you can get to a higher realm and just spend those 4 days praying. One of the things that's been really amazing to me is that within the context of doing ceremonia, I can go without food for many days and I never get hungry. But part of that ceremony is that the people that are outside who are supporting you, they eat. And we ask them to eat a lot and drink a lot of water because they are eating and drinking water for us. So there are times where I have felt that so directly because my granddaughter is a wonderful supporter if you're in ceremony, and I can feel when she's drinking water, I can feel when she's eating, and I'm satisfied. And it's okay that I'm not eating, and it's okay that I'm not drinking water. Now, it's a 4-day ceremony, so the first day I'm like, I'm fine. The second day I'm fine. Sometimes on the third day I'm like, I wonder if this is going to ever finish. And then on the 4th day, when we stop the ceremony, we end with a big feast. So at the ceremony that I'm most recently part of, which is the Lakota Sun Dance, at the end, the dancers stand in a line and we are given cherry juice because cherries are sacred to the Lakota. we're given buffalo meat, a little bit of buffalo meat. And that's how we break our fast, with honoring the buffalo and with some cherry juice. And that is amazing, amazing to have that taste after 4 days of especially the cherry juice, the liquid in your mouth. And it makes me really, when I'm in that ceremony, be so grateful for water, be so grateful for food. And I don't want to eat junk food after that because, I just want to fill myself with good things after that.
Thank you so much.